Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the PharmD Diaries. I'm Angelica, and before we start, I want to apologize for the huge delay in getting this episode out. Life as a P4 student is no joke, and between APPE rotations and planning this episode, I wanted to make sure it truly reflected the hard work we all put in. So thank you so much for staying with us and listening. It truly means a lot. In today's episode, we'll dive into the structure of APPEs at our school, UNTHSC, and share highlights from Block 1, which ran from May 20th to June 28th. You'll hear how the first rotation went for us, followed by a closer look at my Block 1 rotation and an interview with my preceptor. So let's get started. At our school, APPE year is divided into 8 6-week blocks, each focusing on the 5 required rotations, which are ambulatory care, inpatient acute care, community, general hospital, and management. And then management can be divided into either community management or hospital management. Then there's 2 elective blocks, allowing us to explore many different specialized areas of interest. And then we have our off block, giving us some breathing room. Or if you're like me, you're using this time for residency applications and interviews. This structure provides a great way to build on what we've learned in class and apply it to real-life patient care. Block 1 marked the official start of our APPE journey, and it was definitely a learning curve adjusting from the classroom to full-time rotations. For today's episode, Alexis, Hortencia, Mathew, and I will share our Block 1 experiences. Alexis tackled ambulatory care, Hortencia was on her general hospital rotation, Mathew took on a correctional health elective at a federal medical center here in Fort Worth, and I had my academia elective rotation. We'll go ahead and start off with Alexis. So Alexis, take it away.
Hey guys, it's Alexis here. I hope that y'all are all doing well. Hopefully you haven't missed us too much. I'm sorry for the delay on getting things to you guys. It has been a little hectic the last few months with us now being on our APPE rotations, but we have tons of stories and exciting things to tell you guys. So hopefully we will all keep your interest and y'all stay engaged. So I wanted to start off with telling y'all about my Block 1 experience. I did ambulatory care with Dr. Babalola, one of our preceptors, but also a faculty member at our school. And she currently works at the North Texas Area Community Health Center, or NTEC for short. This facility serves mainly an underserved population. So a lot of the patients here speak Spanish, and a lot of them, unfortunately, are uninsured. We even do have some undocumented patients who come into the clinic. And so the way the clinic is set up is we are a grant-funded clinic. So we get money from the state to have this facility open. And not really a portion that I did day in and day out, but a unique thing that I got to see part of or learn a little bit more about is kind of how you get enrolled into this clinic. So they have amazing ladies who work there, and basically the patients come, or potential patients, I should say at this point, they come and they have to provide some sort of like billing statement or bank statement, pay stubs of the past few months, and or like any bills that they pay for housing, transportation, things like that. So that way the ladies who work in the office can kind of determine, one, if they're eligible to be a patient at this clinic, because again, they really do focus on the underserved patient population. So if you do make over a certain amount, then unfortunately you're not able to come to the clinic. But if you do fall within that bracket, and let's say you are able to come to the clinic, then they actually look at how much you make a month and how much your bills and expenses are. And they actually tailor how much you pay the clinic for like your copay, or when you visit the pharmacy, kind of how much money you'd have to pay. So not every patient there has to pay the same copay, so to speak, or the same amount of money to be seen by one of the providers. But it's just a unique thing that this clinic does by being a grant-funded clinic by the state. So there's Dr. Babalola, or Dr. B, if you hear me refer to her as that moving forward. She is the only clinical pharmacist that is there. There's 2 sides to the clinic. There's a pediatric side where they have a provider and nurses, medical assistants, and everybody on that side. And then on our side of the clinic, it was Dr. B, and then they had 2 mid-level providers. So there was Virginia, she was a nurse practitioner, and then we had Miss Monica, who was a physician assistant. I feel like once you spend every day with these people, like day in and day out, and they see you grind, like they're grinding, it's a very busy clinic. you're just going to develop like a relationship with them, and it kind of makes you feel like a little family. And I feel like everybody there was so welcoming. Even the medical assistants who were with each provider, they helped me through everything. They helped in translation, as a lot of the patients who come to the clinic are Spanish speaking patients, and I am not fluent in Spanish in the slightest. But it was very much a learning curve. And along with having the MAs there, I got to become well versed in using medical translation. So actually using people at this facility, it was just via phone, but having like licensed medical interpreters interpreting the things that we say. So that was a huge learning curve too. But something that was really unique about this experience, I mean, most of us get into this profession because we want to help people and because we want to make an impact, right? In the communities that we either grew up in or communities that mean something to us. And I feel like it was just so amazing to see that all of these patients could get some of these like brand name medications, or like Jardiance, for example, which is a new medication that is, I mean, pretty hot commodity. Now, I guess not so much now that GLP-1s are out, but still, like, it's just a great drug for more than just diabetes. And normally it is very expensive. So, working at my retail pharmacy, that medication can be quite costly based on patients' insurances and what kind of coverage they have. So, it was unique to see that, like, the patients could come here and they pay $15 and they get a 90-day supply. So, I mean, it was really great the impact that they're making in the community. And the pharmacist who I worked with, her name was Allison, and she also told me that they have the same thing at the HIV and AIDS clinic in Fort Worth that she also works at. So shout out to them, but it's amazing what they can do. It really does show you that, like, sometimes you may think it's a little impact that you have, or you may think like, oh, this is just a small clinic, like I'm not going to get the same experience, but it really does show you more than just, the medical knowledge that you want to learn. Of course, I learned the ins and outs and in betweens of diabetes and dyslipidemia because every patient who came in, I feel like, was diabetic with their A1C of like 12 or higher. And of course, not always taking their medications or checking their glucose at home and following the small goals that we had set for them the last time that we saw them. But it just really was such an eye-opening experience in more ways than just like pharmacy wide. I think of like the impact that we could have on our community and those around us. So I feel like that was a big thing that I really enjoyed about this rotation. It's a lot of trial and error. I don't think for those whole 6 weeks, I did not close the diabetes guidelines on my laptop the entire time. So I looked at those things every day, in and out. I feel like I went through every chapter, every section for all the patients that we have. Because, of course, when your patients come in, and normally when you are working with an underserved patient population as well, you do tend to have a patient who has more than one disease state as well. So it's not only managing their diabetes, it's managing their CKD on top of their diabetes and potential heart failure. It's like, how do we manage their diabetes? And now you're diagnosed with hypertension while you're here with us. And I will say that, like I mentioned, the staff at the clinic was so great. They are all so smart. I worked at patients for the providers as well to try to see if there's anything that we could do from a pharmacy standpoint of like, hey, this medication maybe isn't needed for them, or maybe they should be on a smaller dose, or hey, that's actually contraindicated because they're also on this other medication. So they really appreciated our feedback and enjoyed us as part of the team as well. But I will say that when they referred patients to us, so when Dr. B got her patients, they typically were the more complex patients. And the patients that the providers saw them for their initial visit, maybe their second, sometimes maybe their third, and like the problem still isn't really getting solved. They've added on medications that they knew would be beneficial or knew would work, but we're still not seeing the results that we would like. And I feel like that was the challenging task for us and for me as a student, like working with Dr. B, is because, I mean, these patients aren't coming to you and they just are diagnosed with hypertension. And you're like, okay, do I start an ACE or an ARB? Or they're not just diagnosed with diabetes with an A1C of like 8.2. And you're like, okay, cool, let's just give them metformin. These are the patients that both type 1 and type 2, but specifically for type 2 diabetes, like these are the patients who come in who have been on metformin, who have been on a sulfonylurea, who have been on maybe not a GLP-1 at the time, but that's kind of the only option that we have, or potentially trying to get Ozempic for some of these patients who are undocumented or don't have the means to be able to pay for these medications as well. So these patients are already coming to you needing like third, fourth, and potentially fifth line medication options because the first line ones and the second line ones weren't working, or they were, but just not having the benefit that we would like to see or that we needed. So it was really trying to dig deep of like, what are truly my options and what is attainable for these patients. Another unique experience that I had specifically with this patient population is working on the patient assistant programs, or it's called the PAP. So basically, it's along the same lines as what the patients would do when they first come in to see if they're eligible to be at the clinic, but they would need to provide us with some sort of billing information, their annual income, and some of these programs, unfortunately, from the manufacturer, do require a social security number. So unfortunately, for some of our undocumented patients, they were ineligible to participate in a PAP, but some of them don't require that, which was an amazing thing. They'd bring it into us and we'd essentially help them fill out the paperwork. We would submit it back to the manufacturer. And I did get to see 2 Ozempics approved while I was there, but it is quite a long process just to fill out the paperwork, send it back, have the manufacturer review it, and then be able to confirm or deny us and then send the product to our pharmacies, which is then delivered to us in the clinic. So I feel like it was quite a tedious process, but I did actually get to see 2 of them go through and actually like be able to give the product to the patient. And I feel like it was just such a heartwarming feeling because you can see how much the patients care and how much they truly appreciate your time that you spent with them. Sometimes it is just like those little moments, and I find true joy in being able to help people in this way. And so I feel like that's one of my favorite moments overall of like working in this clinic too, is just seeing how welcoming and how thankful these patients truly are and their families, because they know that they don't get a lot of other opportunities or a lot of other people to listen. And so just being that lending ear and to let them know that they're not alone and that they're okay, I feel like it's just such an overwhelming experience and something that I would not have gotten if I was not on this rotation. So I feel like it just makes me so excited for everything that's to come with pharmacy. And I have taken everything that I learned and so much more into all of the other rotations that I've had thus far. We just finished block 5, so I won't get into any spoilers because I know that this is for block 1. But if y'all stay tuned, I will tell y'all about all the exciting and crazy experiences that have come from the other rotations that I have had as well. Thank you guys for listening. I'll see y'all soon.
Hey everyone, it's Hortencia. For block 1, I had my hospital rotation and it was at Encompass Health Rehabilitation in Fort Worth. Typically for this rotation, we usually show up around like 9 or 10 in the morning depending on our schedule, and then we'd get handed a list of admissions and discharges. We'd work up our patients. Generally, we'd look for and highlight anticoagulants, insulin, pain meds, and Parkinson's medications. We also looked at transfer orders to see what was added or changed so we could discuss that with the patients. So once we're done working them up, we would head on up to the patient's room, and that's when we'd ask about allergies. We'd do a full med reconciliation, asking about prescription medications, over-the-counter medications, and any vitamins or supplements. Then we'd talk about any changes that were made or anything that was added to their therapy. Then we'd discuss what pharmacy they used, what they used to help them remember to take their medications, such as a pill box, and if they missed any doses of their medications in the last 2 to 3 months. And then lastly, we'd provide informational printouts on the medications we focused on when working them up and going over a few counseling points with them for those medications. All of that was for the admissions. Now, for discharges, we would have to print out a discharge list of what was sent to their pharmacy by the doctor. We'd go over what the medications were for and how to take them. Also, if they had brought any home medications in to make sure that they got them back before they left. Generally, we prioritize discharges over admissions because once a patient left, it was a lot harder to get them over the phone, and it's just better to provide all the counseling in person. So admissions could still wait another day if need be, but we usually would get them done on the same day. The only reason we wouldn't get to a patient is because they were somewhere else in the hospital having therapy, but we could see their schedules and that made it easy to know when they'd be in their rooms. In the midst of all that, when we would be waiting for a patient to be back from therapy, we would be in the pharmacy, signing off on orders received, verifying Pyxis orders, looking over for any renal dose adjustments that are needed, looking at warfarin dosing and INRs, and sometimes we'd even have time to work on our own school projects. but it was definitely a great rotation. I'd recommend it to anybody.
Hey y'all, Mathew here. So for my Block 1 APPE, I did a Correctional Health elective rotation at a federal medical center here in Fort Worth, Texas that houses only female inmates. I feel like people don't really think of pharmacy playing a role within a prison setting, so I thought doing a rotation at a federal medical center would be pretty interesting. I was definitely nervous because this was my first rotation of fourth year, and on top of that, it was in a setting that naturally would make someone feel pretty uneasy, so I was definitely feeling nervous leading up to day one. On the first day, I arrived at the prison, and the process to get in was basically like going through airport security. You kind of take off all your stuff and put them onto a conveyor belt so that it could get checked, and then you'd walk through a metal detector. Afterwards, you'd get your ID badge and either wait for a pharmacist to take you back to the pharmacy or have someone else escort you there. Since I was only going to be there for 6 weeks, my ID badge access was very limited, which meant I had to always be with someone and be escorted around. After getting through the main entrance security gates, I was able to see how the facility was organized. The best way to explain it is that it feels kind of like a college campus, with buildings like dorms that serve as the housing units for the inmates, and then there's a main medical building in the center of it all that has the different services that they provide. Once I got to the pharmacy, everyone welcomed me, and I learned what exactly I'd be doing over the next 6 weeks. The rotation was pretty unique because it provided me a mix of various pharmacy settings like community, inpatient, and ambulatory care. My tasks included shadowing the pharmacist during the day, filling and preparing medications for dispensing, working the window during chow time, which was when inmates could pick up medications from the pharmacy, discussing presentations I would put together outside of rotation since I could not bring any electronics into the prison, and helping them in their ambulatory clinics that they'd run. Every day was a different clinic, and I would say I spent the majority of my mornings assisting them. Over the first few weeks, I mostly just shadowed them and watched kind of how they worked, but then as I became more comfortable with how they operated, I became more involved with the patient care. I eventually began to speak with the inmates about their conditions and learn how to tailor the treatment approach to them. I believe that being involved in the ambulatory clinics is probably where I learned the most, especially in regards to specific disease states like warfarin, opioid use disorder, and diabetes management. These topics came up in future rotations, and because of my previous exposure to them, I was prepared to discuss them extensively when they came up. Some other experiences that were great was being able to shadow different disciplines within the prison. I was able to shadow physical therapy, cardiology, nephrology, and other specialties within the prison setting, which gave me insight on how everyone works together in a federal medical center. I never really pictured myself working for the government, but this rotation gave me a new perspective on that. I learned about the PHS, or Public Health Service, which is another uniformed service of the United States. Almost every pharmacist that worked there was part of PHS, and I really felt a sense of camaraderie with that. If a student was interested in working for the Bureau of Prisons or for the government in general, I would definitely try to do a rotation at a federal medical center. Despite there being inmates around me outside of the pharmacy, I always felt safe and never in danger really. This experience definitely opened up my eyes to different career options and shaped what I would want out of a job. Shout out to Commander Konoski, Lieutenant Cope, Lieutenant Commander Odigwe, and everyone else at FMC Carswell for showing me the ropes and teaching me what exactly working for the Bureau of Prisons means. Take care, y'all.
Hey again, it's Angelica. For my Block 1 rotation, I had the privilege of completing an academia elective under the guidance of Dr. Crystal Hodge, one of our professors and the director of our pharmacokinetics course at UNTHSC. Dr. Hodge is also a board-certified infectious disease pharmacist, which added an extra layer of expertise to my experience. Since my rotation took place at the beginning of summer, I didn't have to handle lectures or interact with students. Instead, I focused on the behind-the-scenes planning, including attending faculty meetings to review the past school year, analyzing student feedback to identify areas for improvement, and discussing changes to better facilitate learning. One of my major projects involved converting a lecture on aminoglycosides for the PK course into an interactive online format, as the course has transitioned away from in-person instruction. It was challenging but fascinating to ensure the material remained engaging and effective in a virtual setting. Shout out to Reagan and the media team from our school's Division of Academic Innovation Department. Dr. Hodge also spends about 1 week every month practicing at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. So I had the chance to follow her there and see her clinical responsibilities. Observing her in a clinical role was an incredible learning experience, and it gave me a deeper appreciation for our professors who balance between academia and clinical practice. Block 1 was definitely a whirlwind, But it set the tone for my APPE year, and I'm so grateful for the guidance and support I received. Dr. Hodge was also kind enough to sit down with me to discuss her journey in pharmacy and advice that she has for students.
Hey y'all, I'm Crystal K. Hodge. I am an associate faculty member here at the University of North Texas Health Science Center College of Pharmacy. I'm also affiliate faculty at the Center for Health Policy, and I practice as a clinical pharmacist specialist in infectious diseases at UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas.
So, can you share a bit about your educational background and what drew you to pharmacy?
Yeah, so that is a little bit of a long story, but I guess kind of prototypical me. It started with a book. So I was probably in like middle school-ish, and I read this really sad book. Now I can't remember the exact details, but I remember at the time being super sad because this poor girl's friend died from cancer, and that like really broke my heart. And I had kind of the traditional family where we would sit down for dinner and watch the news together as a family. And I kept hearing about how terrible cancer was. And I decided as this like middle schooler that I was going to find the cure to cancer and save the world. So I decided to do that, and I actually had a really good teacher who supported me, and I don't know if it was her idea or my idea, but she helped me create this like book drive and really showed me that I could make an impact even being super young. And so then I kept listening to the news with my family because, you know, that's what you do as a kid. And I found out about HIV, and I was like, okay, well, I'll just find the cure to cancer and HIV. And then I went to high school, and by that point, I think the news had shifted to always having like the positive segment at the end. And so it was always talking about these updates and like progress they'd made to curing cancer and HIV. And at that point, I was like, okay, well, someone else is going to find the cure before I even get there. So what am I going to do? I don't know. And I was in high school, and I was in a science research and development course because I really liked chemistry and biology. And most of the students in that class kind of got turned on to engineering, myself included. So I started looking into different fields, and I still liked the drug development idea, though I don't think that I knew it was called drug development at that point. But I started looking into chemical engineering and found out that chemical engineering, you could go into drug design. And so I went to the University of Texas at Austin, which was not super far away from where I grew up, and did undergrad in chemical engineering. I was very fortunate that in high school I did enough AP credit so that I came in to undergrad already in my sophomore year and started taking some of those like classic chemical engineering courses and found out that I absolutely hated it. It was not something that I enjoyed. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't very good at it either, just, you know, for transparency's sake, but I didn't enjoy it. It was not as much of the drug development as I wanted. And so then I kind of had this like, oh no, what am I going to do? And I would say that I'm a religious person. So I think that that's really where I felt God's hand intervening in my life. And I was directed towards MedChem, is a PhD program in the College of Pharmacy. And that was my first introduction to pharmacy, actually. I'd never even thought of it beforehand. I never heard of it really, other than like the brand name retail stores. But I found the PharmD PhD program, decided that, you know, maybe that was my way to get into drug development, and started working at Walgreens. And while I didn't ultimately go into retail, I had a lot of really good managers in retail. So I was very, very blessed from that standpoint. Found out that I loved the patient care side. I got into UT Pharm, so I did my pharmacy school at UT Austin, and then the third and fourth years were actually in San Antonio. So it was like a dual program with the third and fourth years physically in San Antonio at the Health Science Center there. And I really fell in love with the clinical side. I had a professor that was in internal medicine, and I just thought that she was like the best thing ever. She was a great role model. So then, I ultimately decided that I wanted to be her when I grew up, including going into academia. So after doing UT Pharmacy, I matched at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. So I did my PGY1 there. And then I early committed to the PGY2 program, which was between both Emory University Hospital Midtown and Emory University Hospital. So getting to have two different sites was actually really helpful. And then after graduating from my PGY2 program, I started at UNT, actually. So I knew I wanted to go into academia because of my role model in pharmacy school, and have never left because this is honestly the best job for me and my personality. You know, a lot of people say that the grass is always greener on the other side, but I straight up can't even imagine the grass on the other side because there's always ups and downs, but this is definitely where I'm meant to be.
So you mentioned cancer and HIV as being big motivators for your pharmacy career. Can you expand more as to what drew you into becoming an infectious disease pharmacist?
I had that interest in cancer and HIV when I was really young. I would say, like, when I was in pharmacy school, I did not know that I wanted to be an ID or oncology. They were both on my radar. Oncology in particular was on my radar. I did not enjoy either of those modules in pharmacy school. Both of them felt like they were drinking out of a fire hose, and it was just a struggle. So I get it. Like, I have students now who feel similarly, and I'm like, I understand. Like, in pharmacy school, I did not realize that I liked ID. I will say, in retrospect, I can tell that I gravitated towards it because a lot of the faculty that I did projects with, a lot of the things that I ended up doing tended to be ID related, but at the time I had absolutely no idea. I just thought of ID as memorized to survive. So I get that. I was fortunate that in my APPE year, I did take an ID elective. I also took a bone marrow transplant elective, so I did both. And both of them were a lot, but I learned a lot at the same time. And I do recommend the ID elective, especially if it's something that you don't feel like you're particularly strong in. And then I'll be honest, I still didn't recognize how much I liked it until I was in residency. And when I was applying for PGY1s, I had probably like 5. I think on my Excel sheet, I had something like 5 different programs or PGY2s that I was considering. So I went for programs that had PGY2s that I was considering. And Emory was one of them. And I tried to get those rotations in before the early commit process. I was fortunate that I was able to do transplant. By that time, I had already kind of ruled out oncology. But transplant was one of the ones I was considering. Internal medicine was one of the ones I was considering. And with ID, that was when residency is a lot, right? And when I was on my ID rotation, that's when I was really excited to come to work. Like, I would just be like, oh, this is so cool. Like, everyone come look at my computer right now. Like, this is so fun. Like, have you seen this bug name before? Like, this is gibberish, but look how cool it is, right? Like, so that's when I could tell, like, oh, I'm excited to learn about this information. And it's not just that it's new and shiny and I want to do the cool things, right? Which is a little bit of what you have to differentiate when you're on APPEs. But when I was learning ID, especially on residency, and I was applying it to patients, I was like, oh, look how cool this was. And that excitement, I was like, no, that's definitely the field for me. I need to be in something that, helps me get out of bed every day. So that's why I chose to do a PGY2 in ID. And honestly, it was the best decision for me, because similar to how I can't imagine doing anything other than academia, I really can't imagine doing anything else in pharmacy other than ID, because it's just, in my not so biased opinion, the best specialty.
I think that's really good to hear, because I think sometimes as students, we think that we need to have it all figured out about what we want to do, where we want to go once we get into school. So it's nice to know that still residency gives you the opportunity to take some time and be like, you know what, I actually like this a lot better than I thought that I would. So were there any challenges or obstacles that you faced along the way? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I think pharmacy school in general and anybody's pharmacy journey is going to be full of challenges. Residency is a lot. You're trying to cram like 3 years of professional work into 1 year. I think something that I am trying to be an advocate for is highlighting the mental health struggles that sometimes go along with those things. Personally, I was diagnosed with anxiety in pharmacy school. It was actually my P2 year, not unironically. And I've had mental health challenges throughout. So there's the anxiety piece. I've also got depression. So having to overcome those challenges, and sometimes there are obstacles in your way. In pharmacy school, that presented a couple of different ways. I've tried a couple of different medications to help. Some of them have had significant side effects, which is never fun. So dealing with that as well. In my residency program, particularly my PGY2, one of the ways that I compensated was I was actually super healthy at the time. Weirdly enough, I don't recommend this, but this really helped me at the time. In my PGY2, I pretty much cut out all carbs. I cut out all caffeine. I was really big on making sure that I got enough sleep, and I exercised quite a bit. So I was really healthy, and having that physical health helped me compensate for the lack of mental health. Going into academia, these are the things that you don't see, right? So everyone's got their own journey. In academia, while I love my job, I will say that I've still had mental health obstacles that I've overcome or am currently in. It's always a journey of waxing and waning. And so the biggest thing I would say is figuring out ways that can help for you. And everyone's a little bit different. Therapy is a great option. One of the things that helped me the most was finding a faith-based therapist, actually.
Thank you for sharing. What would you say has been the most rewarding aspect of your career so far?
So my absolute favorite, and I would consider this the most rewarding too, is actually seeing students succeed. And part of that is seeing like where they ultimately go, but sometimes it's even as simple as like a thank you note. So the thank you notes that I get from students sometimes, and you've seen them in my office, but I have them all on my wall.
Mm-hmm.
And when I need a note of positivity, sometimes I just look up and start reading them because I love seeing the difference that can be made and helps people ultimately become successful. And one of my favorite thank you notes ever was actually probably one of the shortest thank you notes ever. The scenario was there was a student in one of my courses and she was struggling. She was a really hard worker. She showed up to all the like exam reviews and I could tell that she was always trying, but she was struggling. And towards the final, I could tell she was putting in a lot of work. And so I just randomly sent her an email saying something along the lines of like, good luck on your final. I just wanted to convey that I have faith in you. And later on, she sent me a thank you card. And like I said, it was one of the shortest ones I've ever received, but probably one of the best. And it said something along the lines of, thank you for believing in me when I didn't have faith in myself or when I didn't believe in myself. And I was like, that's one, I'm sad that you didn't believe in yourself at the moment, but it's really cool that I was able to be there for you in that moment. So that was very rewarding. And then, of course, seeing students succeed and seeing them become colleagues. When they come back later and they try to call me Dr. Hodge, I'm like, no, like, you are my colleague now. And, like, you practice in ID or you practice in some other thing. And, like, it's fine. Like, so I love seeing that success.
It is definitely a weird shift, trying to go from your last name to your first name.
Oh, I remember that. When I made that shift, I had one professor who I absolutely adored, and he helped me so much, and I actually still consider him a bit of a role model and mentor. But it took me a couple of years before I was willing to call him by his first name, and it actually took him, like, threatening that he wouldn't associate with me anymore if I kept calling him by his last name. And I was like, no, you can't do that. You're too important. So I eventually learned to call him by his first name.
As you mentioned, you teach at our school and are involved in different organizations and projects here. You also do your clinical practice at UT Southwestern as an ID specialist.
How are you able to manage your time between all of that? Because it's a lot.
Yeah, which you can attest to, right? Because you're on my
Yes.
rotation and you're on an academia rotation. I won't say that I'm the best at it. I think everyone still has things that they can learn, right? No one can manage their time perfectly. One of the ways that I do this is in academia, we have our full-time employee, our FTE, divvied up into different buckets, right? So where we should be dividing our time. So I'm 30% clinical. I think it's something like 30% teaching, and these numbers are going to add up exactly. And then 30% research, and then whatever is left over for service, which can be both profession-wise and like committees and other things at the school. And so because of that, I try to mimic my time based off of those efforts. Though I will say that it does not work out perfectly. I don't have what you would consider like a typical work week. Part of that is because there are different models for academia. And in my practice model, I am at the hospital 1 full week a month, which I love because of the continuity of patient care and getting to be on service for that long and establishing those relationships with the providers and with my colleagues there. The challenge becomes when you have things due at the school or your grant or what have you, they don't recognize when you're at the hospital and patient care takes priority. So sometimes you end up doing things during off hours. Flexibility is a key part of academia, and it goes both ways. So sometimes work demands a lot of you, but sometimes that also means that maybe you have a little bit more flexibility with not like clocking in and clocking out for every little thing, right? So it goes both ways and being flexible, and I really appreciate that. I will say that also having the different buckets and the different focus is very much like my personality. I've been a chicken running around with its head cut off since as long as I can remember. And when I describe that to like my parents, my dad's like, yeah, you've always done that. I'm like, yeah, you're not wrong, right? So I like doing multiple different things. I get bored very easily. And so being able to have an impact and do multiple different things and being able to teach at the same time is actually one of my favorite things. But the time management side is always a struggle. I guess more directly answering your question, a couple of the strategies I use is like the sticky note method. So sometimes I've got a lot of deadlines or I've got a lot of things that are really time intensive, but maybe not due right away. And, how do you work those? So I try to write everything all out and then I'll categorize them into the different sticky notes. And I have the sticky notes on my computer so that I don't have to carry them around with me, so that using those digital tools also helps with the different sites. But like with the sticky notes, I use the quadrant method. So is it time burden and urgent? Is it non-urgent, not a time burden? And you can categorize them that way. The other thing that I try to do is I try to come up with like every day have a like, okay, this is the one thing. If there's anything I'm going to do this day, this is the thing that it's going to be, right? Like I may have 10 things that I want to get done, but sometimes life happens. Sometimes fires occur and you don't expect them. So I've already prioritized, okay, here's my high priority thing and what I'm going to try to focus on today. And I think that that's helped me significantly. I try to encourage students to do something like that, and you can attest to this, like students that are on my rotation, I have them come up with weekly goals so that they can have something that they're working towards, because the idea, and this is not just for students, this is for faculty and actually for probably everyone, right, is that we're always improving. And so you're always in a state of development. So how can you reflect and recognize and find opportunities to improve?
And I can also attest to the sticky note method because I definitely had an issue of prioritizing things because everything just seemed so important to me. So I found the sticky note method to be very helpful. Yeah.
And in the urgent category, I always put the dates so that also helps with because sometimes even the urgent category gets very long. So that can also be helpful. One thing I didn't mention that I should probably add is that when I'm at my practice site, we round twice a day. So in the morning, we round on patients who are known to the service, and in the afternoon, we round on patients that are new because we're a consult-based service. So during the hospital, I will say time management is a little bit trickier, but I try to use out-of-office emails as much as possible to communicate where my priorities are. So when I'm at the hospital, patient care takes the priority. And then if someone needs me to do something and they need me to prioritize it, I may just need them to reach out to me through a different medium. So when it comes to time management, I would also say communication is key for that too.
Very true. So what advice would you give to pharmacy students to help them succeed in school?
The best advice that I could possibly provide is probably the advice that seems like the most common sense, in the sense that it's really making sure that you are sleeping enough. I'm a big advocate of sleep. I feel like you can't mentally process or be with it enough to make good decisions if you're not physically well. And a big part of that is sleep. And that is, I think one of the reasons that I harp on that is both from anecdotal experience, I'm not going to lie, but also that I recognize in students, sleep is one of the first things that they tend to sacrifice. And it really should be one of the last things that they try to sacrifice. So try to make sure that you are getting enough sleep, that you're eating well, you're exercising, and you have those methods for stress relief. The other thing I would say is learn how you learn the best so that you can have the most efficient learning model. And it's not going to be applicable to every subject, right? Like some subjects are going to be different than others in how you learn them. For example, you learn geography different than you learn math, different than you learn debate, right? Those are all very different skill sets, and so you have to learn them differently. But if you know how you learn best, when you find something that you're struggling with, you can try to adapt it as much as possible, or not just have your primary learning method, but also figuring out like your compensatory mechanisms, right? So for example, I hate memorization. I cannot stand memorization, which is really hard in a subject like ID that requires a decent amount of memorization, especially when you're first learning it. And that's something that I struggled with in school. Like I said, I felt like I was drinking out of a fire hose. It was just that like pressurized water, like just hitting you. So one of the ways that I've had to learn how to memorize, and I have to do like traditional flashcards. I can't use like the digital flashcards. They don't work as well for me because I can't just do the right or wrong. I have to do different piles with a different level of frequency because I use repetition as my way to overcome memorization barriers. So that's just an example.
I've also heard that it's better writing things out rather than typing them into like a virtual flashcard. So I'm sure that has something to do with it as well.
Absolutely. So if you look into the science of learning, there's actual evidence to suggest that when you are writing, you're using multiple different parts of your brain versus typing. And so that can reinforce those neural pathways. So writing can be helpful from that perspective. But it doesn't have to be just like, say, memorization. Another way that I've had to compensate that I recommend for students is I'm not an auditory processor. And I'm sure students think that I'm blowing them off half the time when I say this. I don't mean it that way. But like you tell me something, I'm most likely going to forget it. Like there's probably an 80-90% chance that I'm going to forget something that you verbally told me because that's not the way that I learn the best. But when you're on experiential rotations like APPEs or residency, That's the primary method of communication and learning, right? And the whole medical field is based off of having conversations and learning from those. And so I had to compensate with a notebook in my pocket. So I was constantly writing things down so I didn't forget them, because I knew if I didn't, then I would, right? So another, I guess, piece of advice I would have for pharmacy students is not only learning your best way to learn, but think about how you can compensate for the areas that are harder for you to learn in. For APPEs in particular, in addition to learning like how you learn the best, hopefully you've picked up on a lot of that through didactics and then coming up with those compensatory mechanisms. The other thing with APPEs is really developing those critical thinking and problem solving skills, as well as being flexible. So every 6 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on what school you're at, right? Like things are going to change on you pretty dramatically. So you have to be able to go with the flow. You're also going to have different preceptors who have different expectations, different personalities, different ways they communicate or prefer to communicate, and they may differ from yours. So flexibility is a really key part of that. Again, I would emphasize that sleep really helps with your ability to be flexible, right? Emotionally processing things is easier when you've been sleeping, right? So, or getting adequate sleep, I should say. So that's a big thing that I harp on. And then one of the things that we're trying to develop on APPE skills is teaching you more of the gray, like in class, because there's a grade associated with it. It's very black or white. And it's just a matter of like, can you use test taking strategies, or can you remember that detail that helps you get to the right answer? On APPEs, most patients don't follow the textbook, right? So you don't have that option. And so it's how do you use critical thinking and problem solving skills that you may not have utilized as much in some of your courses, especially if you've learned how to take an exam. So those critical thinking skills become incredibly important in thinking about what are the different variables and what are some of the nuances with each variable that I need to consider.
So what methods or approaches have you found to be most effective in engaging and educating your students?
This is a bit of a two-pronged question, because there's the teaching in the curriculum, the didactic teaching, and then there's the experiential teaching. So when it comes to didactic teaching, I actually really love reading about this area. It's called pedagogy, like the study of teaching. And, I think some of this stemmed from the fact that I enjoy academia. Right. And some of this stems from the fact that I also struggled with learning ID in pharmacy school. So it's like, how do I help students not struggle with something that I struggled with? Right. So how can I help? Right. It's this huge passion for helping. And so there's quite a bit of research on different learning styles. I'll say some of those studies are flawed, and some of them have shown that even learning styles like the visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic, some of those studies showed no difference. Personally, I think that maybe that's because of the study design, or maybe it has to do with the material, because I do think that people have a preference and it's easier to learn in the method that you are most familiar with learning, right? So, for example, in pharmacy school, I was not a visual learner at all. If you had a graphic or a picture or something in my slides, you could consider them blank, because I wasn't going to be learning from that. I was not visual in any way, shape, or form, but one of the things that as a professor I've become more sensitive to is visual learners and kinesthetic learners. For example, when I was at one of my practice sites, not my current one, but a previous one, I was speaking with a pharmacist, and they were really struggling with the concept of colonizers and like what organisms colonize different sites on the body. And he just kept saying, I just can't see it. I just can't see it. And I didn't know how to help him at the time, but I kept thinking about it, and I honestly couldn't sleep for, I don't know if it was just that day or several days, but it was heavy on my mind. I could not sleep because I could not figure out how to help this man see the colonizers. But because of that, I ended up creating Doug's Bugs, which is a tool I use in the classroom that has different organs in different locations where different organisms are colonizers, so that it's a little bit more visual, like you can see the specific places on the body. And I will say, I don't know if this is true or not. This is me taking credit for something that I shouldn't have created, but I did come up with it on my own. After I created that and started using it several years later, I started noticing it show up in other resources. And so I don't know if they got it from me or what, or if we all just happen to have the same idea. But, there's some validation there. But yes, I think learning your learning style, learning how you learn the best. I also try to work very hard with our Division of Academic Innovation, DAI, to come up with different tools. So for my kinesthetic learners, trying to come up with different cases or interactive games that they can do to help them learn the material. I try to provide as many resources as possible so that for our readers, if they're like, no, I need more information on this, they have a whole slew of what I consider high priority resources for that topic. I do have to balance that though, because there are some students who will see the list of supplemental optional reading, and I'm doing air quotes here, like supplemental optional reading, and some of them get freaked out thinking that they have to read it all. And I'm like, no, that's really just like if you happen to be one of those reader learner types and you want more information, or you are like me and you just think it's really cool and want to keep reading about it. And so that's more like the didactic, how do I get each learner? So it's trying to figure out what their learning style is, what are their preferences. Sometimes, honestly, that is also about identifying what the problem is. So one of the things that I will often have is students, they'll come to me and they'll say that they're struggling. I'm like, okay, well, what is the struggle? Which part of it is it? And it's sometimes just helping them identify what the problem is that can help with generating solutions, right? Because they're focused on the solutions, but they haven't quite identified what the problem is, like where is the misstep. On the experiential side, I will say that I focus a little bit more on motivation and different influences so that students can help set themselves up for success in the best way possible. And you've heard me talk about this a little bit because we're on an academia rotation. But there are multiple different things that impact you on a daily basis. And I really liked the 6 influencer model from, I want to say it's Crucial Influencer, but not like social media influencer. This is more like in general. But I like that model because it breaks it down in between motivation and ability and whether it's personal, social, or structural. And I think that a lot of health profession students, myself included, and I see this in a lot of pharmacy students, tend to say, oh, I'm just not good enough. It's a me issue. And I was like that too. A lot of what I do with engaging students is trying to say, okay, sure, there may be an ability piece, but that's not it. That's not all of it anyway, right? Like, what are some of the other things we do that can help set yourself up for success? Like, is there anything that's a structural barrier for you? Like, maybe it's that you're not sleeping enough. So maybe we work on that. Maybe you're in a really high stress time just because of other life circumstances. So maybe we work on mental health and stress relief kind of skills. So it's thinking about some of those other influences as well. I really like that model. And then when it comes to engaging students, especially in APPEs, I try to think about what is their motivation, right? So what inspired them to be a pharmacist? What do they want to do after graduation? Because if they want to, say, go into academia, then maybe I have them read more academia articles or listen to more podcasts, right? So if people, like, we're on a podcast now, so if you like podcasts, I have several podcasts that I listen to during commutes that I think could be helpful. Maybe that would be helpful for them. One other thing for engaging students is thinking about what I say, like what they want to do after graduation, also meaning like what career path. So for example, if I'm trying to have a student demonstrate that they know adverse effects of medications, I can do that in a couple of different ways. If I know that they want to go into, say, the community setting, then I may have them do more patient counseling to demonstrate that. If I know they want to go into the retail setting, then maybe I do more lab monitoring type of an emphasis. So how can I take what is the true objective of the rotation to make sure that they're safe practitioners and adjust it and align it with what motivates them so that it doesn't just become another chore and it becomes something that they can actually have fun while learning, because that's what learning is supposed to be. It's supposed to be fun.
What emerging trends have you found particularly interesting?
So in general, I would say the trend that I find particularly interesting, and like I'm probably obsessively thinking about this, is different trends in generational preferences and thinking about how my learners are changing and what their preferences are. And I will say that Generation Z has some of the most diverse preferences. Like most generations have like one definitive preference, and then there's like the outliers that may be slightly different. Right, with Gen Z, it tends to be much more diverse than that. And so it's how do I adjust what I'm teaching? And so I'm constantly thinking about some of those generational trends. I'm thinking about technology. How did COVID change things? And hybrid models, and how do we teach effectively? Like you've been helpful with some of my courses changing to online. That's a different way of teaching, right? So how do I make sure that I am sufficiently engaging the students and teaching them in a way so that they can be the most successful and the best pharmacist? In ID, some of the things I find most exciting is actually one of the reasons that I love ID the most, and that's because ID is everywhere. Like it is the definition of ubiquitous, and it is constantly evolving. So you can never feel truly comfortable in ID because it's going to change on you. And there's not usually, I mean, other than maybe penicillin for syphilis, there's usually not like a definitive right answer. It's going to be in the gray. So I love the puzzle piece. And then we're learning so much more about the immune system too. So the immune system, I think, is just absolutely fascinating and well beyond my understanding, especially from like a biochemistry side. But thinking about that interaction between the immune system, the infection, and how the drugs play a role, and then how on earth is industry supposed to keep up with the evolution of organisms, and then our immune system's changing, and some of the trends in like global infections, and how does that all interact? And it's so much to think about, but that's also part of the exciting part, is trying to put those puzzle pieces together and being able to both zoom out and zoom in, right? So like you can zoom out to the global scale, and you can zoom down slightly to like maybe your hemisphere, and then maybe your country with the different infections. I think the pandemic was a classic example of that. Immunizations and side effects from those, and then different public health things that we can do, like how do we eliminate HIV? It's been a goal for like 40 years now. So different things like that. And you can zoom down to even like your region or your city or the patient sitting in front of you. So I love that variation. And I will say that it's constantly changing on me, which keeps me on my toes. But again, I think I've already established that if I'm not a chicken running around with my head cut off, I'm probably not thriving. So that's one of the reasons that I love ID. I don't know if that's necessarily an emerging trend, but I will say that those trends overlap because ID is always going through to some emerging trend.
All right. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share with our audience?
My last piece of wisdom is something I've already said, but I'm going to harp on it because I think it's important. So find the things that are important to you. So family, music, for me, also God. Find the things that help you get through the day and find what you're excited about. Hopefully you've been able to hear in my voice how passionate I am about this field and about what I do. And I hope you guys all find that and continue to succeed. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hodge. Block 1 is just the beginning of our APPE year. And it's okay to feel overwhelmed as you transition from the classroom to rotations. Give yourself grace, lean on your peers, and celebrate every small win. I'll let Alexis have the final word on what she took away from Block 1.
I will just tell you that if you just wake up every day and embrace the challenges and try not to get so bogged down with everything you don't know or lack of confidence, because that's something that I really struggled with Block 1 and I'm getting better at, but I'm still working on. If you just wake up every day and just choose to put your best foot forward and just try to truly focus on today and just what the impact you can have today is. And my favorite motto is, that's a tomorrow problem, because if it's not worth my time stressing over today, then I can do that another time, because I just want to be my best self day in and day out. And so this is some motivation, hopefully, and something to look forward to, all of you who have this journey ahead.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. A big thank you to Dr. Crystal Hodge for sitting down with me and sharing her insights. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you enjoyed our journey through the pharmacy student experience, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your support means the world to us. If you have any questions, topics you'd like us to cover, or if you want to share your own PharmD story, feel free to reach out via email at diariespharmd@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at PharmD Diaries Podcast. Remember, you are not alone on this journey, so take care, study hard, and keep chasing your pharmacy dreams.
Bye.